82 years ago, on a warm Monday morning, the lives of many Midwesterners would never be the same. November 11th, 1940 was organized to be a day of celebration. Armistice Day, now known as Veterans Day, began in 1919 to commemorate the signing of the armistice that ended the fighting in World War I. Many men, women, and children were home from work and school that day to celebrate with parades and patriotic speeches. This day of celebration took a cold turn that had many Midwest duck hunters fighting for mere survival amongst a frozen hell. Today, this historical event is known as the Armistice Day Blizzard. Many in the waterfowling community refer to a different name, a name that carries a chilling reminder of the dangers any duck hunter could face at a moment's notice, known as the day the duck hunters died.
In November of 1940, the United States was enjoying a time of peace and prosperity. The Second World War was brewing in Europe, and the United States was watching safely from the sidelines. Japan had not yet even begun to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor that would solidify December 7th, 1941, as a date which will live in infamy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just been reelected for his third term as president, signaling what many Americans believe to be the end of the Great Depression. Americans are using this newfound optimism to enjoy traveling to the movie theater to watch the Knute Rockne All-American movie, starring a young up-and-coming actor named Ronald Reagan. Many Midwesterners are enjoying the last days of unusually warm weather. The warm breeze blowing through the open windows with the sashes dancing like a young couple doing the jitterbug. Bing Crosby's Only Forever, soothing entire families as the smell of a warm apple pie emits a comforting smell of delicious flavor throughout the home while cooling on the windowsill, taunting the children playing baseball on the sidewalk. Yes, life in the Midwest was the epitome of the American dream. The summer of 1940 was known as an Indian summer, a period of unseasonably warm weather that extends into the fall. Duck hunters were becoming more frustrated with the weather than they were the number of mosquitoes that were laying host to every trip to the duck blind. Duck hunters spent the early part of the duck season hunting for local birds that stay in the area throughout the year. These include teal, widgeon, shovelers, and the chance mallard. While waterfowlers enjoy the outdoors and taking in the local wildlife, what hunters yearn for is the yearly migration. Duck hunters lie in wait for the weather that has many others nestled around the fireplace with a hot cup of coffee. During the warm fall, ducks were spending their time comfortably engorging themselves on the Canadian prairies before their long migration south to escape the oncoming cold. Every year, as the winter bears its ugly head, ducks migrate south. Their food sources begin to be covered in varying amounts of snow, while their favorite water holes begin to freeze over. The coming of cold weather would darken the Midwestern skies with ducks of all varying species. Watching their streamlined flight with sharp, moving, fast wings would make any duck hunter feel like a child seeing the marvelous spectacle again for the first time. During these warm days of fall, duck hunters were eagerly awaiting and wishing for the first cold front that would set in motion the yearly biological clock of the ducks to begin the same great southern migration that generations of waterfowl had before. These duck hunters would soon learn a dangerous lesson of Aesop's age-old phrase, "Be careful what you wish for." The weather forecast that each of us have access to at our fingertips was not a reality in 1940. During this time, weather bureaus only worked 12 to 15 hours per day, taking rudimentary observations twice a day at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. The local bureaus would transmit their information to the Weather Service in Chicago. From Chicago, the weather forecasts were telegraphed throughout the Midwest from Indiana to the Dakotas. The forecast information was thus spread through a variety of methods, including advertisement cards located in public buildings, telegraphs, and radio broadcasts. Access to this information was elusive for many, especially rural farmers that depended on their farmer's almanac for any pertinent information. Anyone that has lived in the Midwest knows that the weather changes as often as the second hand on the clock moves. Due to only having twice daily forecast readings and inconsistent weather patterns, there was a large room for error. The forecast on November 10th called for music to every duck hunter's fine-tuned ear. Cold, snow, wind, and clouds. The perfect mixture of weather systems that would finally begin the migration that every duck hunter had so impatiently been waiting for. Forecasting technology was not able to identify the looming storm, but couldn't in their wildest dreams predict the magnitude that was about to ravage the Midwest. In early November, the storm was beginning to gather speed. Pressure was beginning to fall in the Pacific Northwest and formulating gale force winds. These winds led to the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington State, the third longest suspension bridge in the world at that time. As the storm traveled over the Rockies, the cold, dry, polar air gained speed as it swept across the prairies. During this time, there was a current of warm, moist subtropical air being blown northwards from the Gulf of Mexico. As the two weather systems converged, so was the creation of a sinister combination that would forever change life in the Midwest as people knew it. Unaware of what was truly about to bestow the Midwest, duck hunters were enthusiastic that the following day was the widely recognized holiday of Armistice Day. Armistice Day was a celebration of the armistice or ceasefire that was signed in 1918 to end the fighting of World War I. Armistice Day would be celebrated yearly on the anniversary of the armistice signing on November 11th to commemorate all the fallen soldiers and the return to peace following the most widespread global conflict that humankind had ever seen to that point in history. In 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower would change the name of Armistice Day to what we now know today as Veterans Day to celebrate all veterans of the U.S. military. In 1940, Armistice Day fell on a Monday. Kids were off of school, and many adults were not required to report to work. Instead, many Americans took the opportunity to enjoy patriotic parades and speeches to celebrate. Many duck hunters believed that the current events of a brewing cold front and a day off work were a match made in heaven. Waterfowl hunting is still a popular sport today, playing host to 80,000 registered duck hunters in Minnesota's population of 5.5 million alone. In 1940, Minnesota reported 120,000 duck hunters out of their population of 2.79 million. As many wide-eyed and eager duck hunters arose on the morning of November 11th, 1940, they were met with 55-degree weather and a slight breeze. For any true Midwesterner, this was short-sleeve weather. Duck hunters grabbed their thermos of coffee, shotgun, and flannel shirt as they walked out the door. In the black darkness of night before the dawn, hunters paddled their skiffs, canoes, or ran their small, cranky outboard motors to their favorite secret spots. Hunters took their claim in marshes, rivers, lakes, and every other body of water that the hunter's instincts felt would attract the sought-after waterfowl. Next was the tedious procedure of placing hand-carved wooden decoys on the water. Decoys are model ducks that are used to visually attract flying waterfowl to make them feel comfortable and land at the given spot chosen by the hunter. Hunters often use a surgical type of precision in placing their decoys in just the right manner to mimic real ducks that will result in a successful hunt. As the first signs of the warm glow of sunlight began to rise over the horizon, Hunters began to hunker down in their rolled-up flannel shirts and blue jeans tucked inside their hip waders. As the sun's reflection began to warm cold faces from the darkness, the winds of change choreographed a performance of ripples on the water's surface. Hopeful hunters lie in wait for the wind to bring the morning flight into their decoys, hearing the sound of fast flapping wings before seeing the beautiful flocked green heads of mallards cruising the sky. As the morning drew on, the weather worsened. In a matter of hours, the temperature dropped by 10 degrees, the slight warm breeze increased to 20-mile-per-hour winds, and a light rain began to fall. This wasn't alarming to the hunters on the water that morning. Bad weather meant that ducks were going to be flying, and hunters had to be ready at any moment to take their shot. After all, the sight that every duck hunter dreams about and yearns for is a duck landing on the water during a windy day. As ducks are flying in the sky, many become interested in a spread of decoys that almost appears too good to resist. The flying ducks, unsure of what lies below, circle the decoys many times, circling above before committing to land, using this crucial time to guarantee that the ducks below are going to offer a warm welcome when they arrive. For duck hunters, this spectacle offers the ultimate test of patience. If the hunter moves, the birds may scare away. If the hunter didn't get the decoys spread perfectly, the ducks may realize the trap being set for them. If the hunter decides to shoot too early, the ducks will be out of range and fly away, leaving their worries behind. Minutes that felt like hours later, hunters are rewarded with the picturesque image of a fully cupped bird. For ducks to land, they need to slow down. Ducks will fly into the wind, wings cupped to slow their speed, and feet stretched out to brace for landing. This is the moment that the hunter has been waiting for. Pulling up his shotgun, placing the front bead on the duck, and watching the bird fall from the sky. Loose feathers floating down to earth coupled with the plopping sound of the duck hitting the water, being the final sensation of reward for all of the hard work and patience that culminated in this very moment.
Waterfowl hunting in the 1930s and 40s would have looked very simplistic by today's standards. Now, a lot of duck hunters that left their homes on the morning of Armistice Day in 1940 would have had a lot of the items that I'm wearing and have on the table before you. Starting with what I'm wearing, a lot of duck hunters would have left the house that day wearing a button-up shirt, much like I'm wearing. They also would have left the home with blue jeans and, to protect themselves in the water, rubber hip boots such as these. Now, to help keep the sun and the rain out of your eyes, a lot of people wore hats that looked like this, called Jones hats. Now, to protect themselves even further in case the weather were to, per se, get worse, a lot of men had their jackets. And a lot of men brought whatever jacket they could get their hands on. Now, this is an example of a jacket made in the 1940s that a duck hunter very well could have brought with him that day. The lucky duck hunters had what were called wax canvas jackets. Now, wax canvas is a jacket that's made out of canvas that's applied with a thin layer of wax. Now, what that does is help make the material water resistant. So it is still not waterproof, but it does help. Some of the accessories that the duck hunters would have had were duck calls such as these. Now, right here is what your typical duck hunter would have had, and this is a hand-carved wooden duck call. And these were almost an art form, and some of the best carvers during this time became very popular for their work. In the South, they made a different type of call that looked very much like this. And this was actually made out of bamboo, which could be found in the South, and made it a very popular item, especially among the market hunters. Now, eventually over time, and especially around the time of the Armistice Day Blizzard, a new type of duck call was starting to come onto the scene that looked just like this. And this was some of your first plastic duck calls like what we have today. And this one was made by the P.S. Olt Company. All these duck calls can still be found being made today, and some of the originals can go for a lot of money. Now, duck hunters also had carved decoys. So these hand-carved decoys, just like the calls, were an art form. And so these hunters would do their best to make the decoys look as close to realistic as possible and make them so they would float on the water to look like ducks and help attract more ducks to land in range of the hunter. Now, one thing the duck hunters would have really loved to have, especially on Armistice Day, would have been one of these. And these were their little hand warmers for that time. What these were is you fill them full of lighter fluid, and then you would start it, and this is what you would keep in your pockets, in your hands, to help keep your hands warm. And finally, the duck hunters would have been using guns during this time that looked a lot like this. Now, this is a pump action 1897 Winchester. And so every time you want to fire this gun, you have to pump it just like this between every shot. Okay? Now, the ammunition that they were using looked just like these. Now, the ammunition during this time was made out of lead. Since this time, lead is no longer allowed to be used during waterfowl hunting because we know it's toxic chemicals that can affect the water and the wildlife around them. Overall, this is what the duck hunters during 1940, during the Armistice Day Blizzard, would have been wearing and using during their hunt. Waterfowl hunting in 2023 looks much different than it did in 1940. But if we look at the clothing and the equipment that people used, it is actually very similar in many ways. Starting with the clothing that I'm wearing, this jacket is a 3-layer jacket, meaning that there are 3 layers that you can either add or take away depending on the weather. This piece of technology very well might have saved the lives of many hunters during the Armistice Day Blizzard of 1940. Just like my jacket, my waders that I'm wearing have a zippered liner that you can once again either put in or take out depending on the weather. And you can also see they come up much higher, that allows a hunter to wade further out into the water. Now, looking at trying to keep warm, a lot of hunters, especially that grew up in the Midwest, know hot hands very well. These one-use hand warmers, they even have foot warmers as well, that keep our body warm while we're hunting or doing activities outside. This is, although different, it still is a great piece of technology that is used widely to this day. Duck hunters also use a variety of different duck calls. Now, as you can see, the duck calls look much different today, being mostly made out of plastic, and especially today, acrylic is becoming very popular. So we have duck calls for a variety of different species, such as mallards, geese, wood ducks, divers, and teal, just to name a few. We also have decoys. Now, the decoys have lost part of their art, so to speak. Although they're still not hand carved, they still look amazing and look lifelike while floating on top of the water. Made out of plastic with weighted keels on the bottom to keep them upright in the water. What we also have in 2023 are motion decoys. And these motion decoys allow ducks that are flying over to see motion in the decoys and attract them to try and land. And one like that is next to me is a spinning wing decoy. When pressing a button, the wings spin and looks like a duck that's getting ready to land. And so, looking at the equipment that hunters use to kill the ducks, this is almost kind of a bridge of technology, and this is a Browning A5, modeled after the Browning Auto 5 that has been used by waterfowl hunters for well over 100 years. A lot of waterfowl hunters would argue that the Browning Auto 5 has killed more ducks than any other weapon in history, known for its humpback design, so when you aim the gun, your eye level immediately looks straight down the barrel. What you'll see most hunters using these days are a semi-automatic gun like this. Cerakoted finish to protect from rust with a camo design on it to help hide. Now, much like the Browning Auto 5 or the Browning A5 that I have here, these are semi-automatic, meaning that it shoots every time you pull the trigger. But due to regulations today, you must have a plug in your gun that only allows 3 shells to be loaded at one time. And finally, the ammunition. As I mentioned before, lead is no longer allowed to be used during waterfowl hunting due to its toxic chemicals. So what you'll find mostly these days are steel shot. Now, besides steel shot, what you also see a lot of is this current trend going towards bismuth as well. So as I said, this is what most duck hunters use to this day. And when we look at the design features of all of this technology, it still has the same intended use that it did in 1940. And us duck hunters still can relive the past to this day.
As the weather began to worsen, duck hunters were too distracted to realize the severity of the weather around them. Their eyes and focus were fixated on the increasing number of birds that continued to appear as the weather intensified. As the wind continued to surge to over 50 miles per hour, the sleet turned to snow. And this should have been a surefire sign for hunters to sense urgency in their own safety. What happened next can only be described as witnessing the most breathtaking masterpiece that can be bestowed upon any outdoorsman. Dale Engler of Alma, Wisconsin, hunting on backwater of the Mississippi River, described his experience.
Redheads and mallards by the thousands were flying over and on both sides of me. By this time, those ducks were coming down the river had gusts of 60-mile-per-hour tailwind behind them. Hundreds of ducks came past me within 15 feet, probably going around 80 miles an hour.
The skies were filled with flocks of mallards, redheads, bluebills, as well as the proclaimed King of the Ducks, canvasbacks. Hunters reported endless flocks of divers, bluebills, redheads, and canvasbacks, while others rave about the endless waves of mallards by the thousands. No one could have imagined that the number of ducks would rival the number of stars in the sky. The storm had finally pushed these anticipated ducks off their northwestern grazing grounds. Those that lived to tell the tale of what they witnessed would describe the chain of events as the best day of duck hunting that they had ever experienced. As these exhausted ducks fought to find shelter from a storm they couldn't even begin to fathom, duck hunters were encapsulated by this experience, and many made a fatal mistake. A number of hunters couldn't turn their backs on the once-in-a-lifetime hunt that was unfolding before their very eyes, asking themselves if the storm could really get any worse. Dale Engler recounts what encouraged him to stay on the water that day.
At 2 o'clock, the rain turned into wind-driven sleet and snow, and within the next 2 hours, I saw more waterfowl than I've ever seen in my life. About that time, some hunters started to go ashore, but I thought it was just an early snowstorm and paid no attention. Besides, I was having the time of my life.
The hunters that did stay would wait until the end of shooting hours at 4 p.m. or fill their daily bag limit of 15 birds. The duck hunters that decided to stay would return home with a story that would rival that of Odysseus and his journey home to Ithaca. By the time personal safety outweighed the desire for ducks, any idea of escape was obsolete. The fight for pure survival would test every fiber of each and every soul that was left helpless in the clutches of unforgiving Mother Nature. Superior Wisconsin native and outdoors journalist Gordon McQuarrie poetically recalls the lure that drove many men blindly to their grave.
Mother Nature caught hundreds of duck hunters on the Armistice holiday. She lured them out of the marshes with fine, whooping wind, And when she got them there, she froze them like muskrats in traps. She promised ducks in the wind. They came all right, but by that time the duck hunters were playing a bigger game with the wind, and their lives were the stake.
As hunters began to realize the dire consequences that were upon them, many began their hopeless flee to safety. During the 1940s, most duck hunters used canoes, skiffs, flat-bottom boats designed to traverse shallow water and offer stability, as well as motorized boats. In the frigid, cold, harsh weather, the cranky outboard motors wouldn't turn over, leaving the hunters stranded. The lucky hunters with their cranky outboard motors had a blessing in disguise. The hunters that were able to start their motors discovered their fate sprung in a trap. As the hunters traveled across the water in hopes of warmth and safety, they were met with up to 80-mile-an-hour wind gusts and 3 to 15-foot waves, depending on the body of water. These frigid, crashing waves threw water over the sides of the boats. The boats quickly became swamped or overturned. The poor souls that were in these boats lay victim to the icy waves. Hunters on Big Muskego Lake, just 20 miles from downtown Milwaukee, reported witnessing the fate of another hunter. The group of hunters fighting for survival on shore noticed through the hazy blizzard a man in his skiff, trapped by the waves and ice on the lake. They observed the man come to terms with his fate as he leaned back in his skiff with his face pointed towards the sky. The men watched in horror as the man stretched his arms towards the heaven with his palms turned upward. In the man's final moments, he was imploring God for just one miracle, or was commending his soul to him. The hunter then slumped against the side of his skiff motionless. His spirit, like the ducks that drew him out on that terrible day, had flown. The hunters that were unable to attempt an escape were trapped in the variety of rivers, sloughs, and marshes. The despairing idea that no man dared say out loud was a question of how long can this go on? As the wind and waves tore apart duck blinds and swept away boats, it was a frantic rush to find any sort of safety for the night. The hunters that left home that morning could not identify any sort of tell that this weather system would be swept upon them. Hunters had left their homes ill-prepared, with shirt sleeves, canvas jackets, and blue jeans. As the clothes became wet and the temperature continued to drop, their clothes began to freeze solid. The light canvas clothing did have water-resistant properties in 1940, but not for as long as most people were exposed to the storm, becoming waterlogged and useless in a matter of time. The air became so moist that survivors compared it to syrup that almost made it impossible to breathe without the feeling of their lungs being seared. In the panic, many hunters waded into the water that felt warmer than the Arctic air. The consequence of their rash actions led to them freezing solid like pier posts standing in the water. As the weather continued its horrid tear and the snow proceeded to accumulate, men were preparing for a night that may never see the dawn. Many began to overturn their boats to hide underneath to at least shelter them from the elements. Others huddled together in groups to find the slightest sense of comfort and warmth. Some looked at their dogs and saw the helpless look in their eyes, knowing that there was nothing they could do. Hugged their dear companions tightly and just prayed for one miracle. One man even survived by digging out and climbing into a muskrat hut to escape the elements. The priority of everyone trapped in the great blizzard was to find warmth. Matches had become useless from becoming waterlogged or being extinguished by the violent wind. If a hunter were fortunate enough to have dry matches, dry fuel was even more elusive. Finding dry limbs on the ground was out of the question. Some hunters burned through all of their ammunition trying to shoot limbs from the trees or attempting to ignite the gunpowder from their shotgun shells. Others sacrificed their wood-carved decoys, yearning for that much-desired feel of warmth from a fire. Throughout the night, the weather persisted in her attempt to incapacitate everyone fighting for survival. The weather that began in the 50s that morning dropped drastically to negative 55 degrees with wind chill, accompanied by nearly 3 feet of snow. Death by exposure was an ever-haunting reality that quickly and deliberately overcame helpless souls fighting for survival, ushering in a desolate end to life. Death was anything but quiet. In the night air, the howls of the gale tearing through the marshes and sloughs were scarcely interrupted by the gunshots beckoning for help or the desperate screams for mercy that fell on deaf ears. 14-year-old Raymond Sharon of Winona, Minnesota, remembers.
The thing that I remember best was the unending scream of the wind. The sound of distant gunshots reached us several times. Far-off yells for help.
The men that did have the luxury of seeing the morning sun were not met with the answer to their prayers. The rising sun of morning that was thought to signal an end to their suffering was only a mirage, masking the dire circumstances that were still surrounding them. Many men survived the night huddled in groups, hiding under overturned boats, and sometimes simply running for their lives in circles to keep their bodies from freezing. The morning of November 12th had many families asking themselves if they would ever see their loved ones again that did not return the day before. Herds of people traveled to the nearest taverns and boat launches looking for their loved ones and began planning their rescue. The weather still had not improved, with strong winds, 0-degree temperatures, over 3 feet of snow, and up to 20-foot snowdrifts in some areas. There were many obstacles standing in the way of rescue, the most obvious being road closures due to snowdrifts. Thousands of cars had been marooned on public roadways that would take days to be dug out. Many of the cars buried in snow were little more than steel tombs for the unfortunate souls that froze to death during the night, waiting for the rescue that would never come. The other obstacle that stood in the way of rescue parties were the semi-frozen waterways scattered throughout the Midwest that lay temporary home to hundreds of duck hunters. The goal of duck hunting is to hide oneself from the visual sight of flying ducks, but now the challenge was to make themselves visible for rescue. Rescue parties sprang to action throughout the Midwest trying to find a needle in a haystack that was the lives of their friends and loved ones. Gordon McQuarrie writes about the heroes that rose to the occasion to help their fellow man during the blizzard.
By that time, men along the Mississippi were drowning and freezing. The ducks came, and men died. They died underneath upturned skiffs as the blast sought them out on boggy, unprotected islands. They died trying to light fires and jumping and sparring and trying to keep warm. They died sitting in skiffs. They died standing in river water to their hips, awaiting help. They died trying to help each other. 100 tales of heroism will be told long after the funerals are over.
Two heroes of the Armistice Day Blizzard were Max Conrad and the crew of the tugboat Joseph Throckmorton. The Throckmorton had docked for the season in Fountain City, Wisconsin, just across the Mississippi River from Winona, Minnesota. The crew ran multiple trips into the Mississippi backwaters to rescue stranded hunters in the labyrinth of the waterways on the mighty Mississippi. To help the Throckmorton and other rescue vessels locate stranded hunters, Max Conrad would serve as their guardian angel. Conrad was a native of Winona, Minnesota. The night of the blizzard, Max Conrad was in attendance of a concert showcasing a young Milwaukee native, pianist Walter Liberace. Conrad owned a Piper Cub, a single-propeller lightweight monoplane that he used to fly over the Mississippi backwaters to locate lost hunters. Conrad went against better judgment to risk his own life to save the lives of others. His lightweight plane was tossed around in the sky by the 40 to 50 mile an hour winds. Conrad was able to locate many hunters. More often than not, he was too late and only bore witness to the remains of lifeless souls. For those that were still alive, Conrad would offer all the help he was capable of. He would bring his plane low to the ground and cut off the engine as to be heard and yell to the survivors, He would then circle around and drop canisters of sandwiches, dry matches, cigarettes, and whiskey to aid the survivors until help arrived. Conrad would then circle the location of the survivors until either the Throckmorton or other vessels were able to arrive and provide rescue. Conrad would then move on and continue his search for the next hopeful survivor, scanning the landscape for any sign of life or death. Max Conrad flew his Piper Cub all day on November 12th and returned to the airfield in Winona until the morning of November 13th, where once again Conrad took flight, looking to be the answer to so many unanswered prayers, until 10 p.m. that night. One of the young men saved by Conrad and the Throckmorton was 17-year-old Gerald Terrace. On the morning of November 11th, Gerald, his father Carl, brother Ray, family friend Bill Wernicke, and their black lab embarked into the Mississippi River bottoms. By noon, all of them were trapped by 6-foot swells. They spent the rest of the day unpromisingly beating on each other for the slightest feeling of warmth. At 2 a.m. that morning, the family friend uttered his final words in Gerald's arms. After 23 hours without rescue, Gerald's brother finally succumbed to the elements and passed. Shortly after noon, after all hope was considered lost, Gerald and his father heard the faint sound of a plane engine approaching overhead. As Gerald waved his arms frantically, he heard Max Conrad's voice say that help was on the way. By 2:30, the Throckmorton located Gerald holding his black lab tightly, fighting to stay alive. Unfortunately, the arrival of the Throckmorton was half an hour too late to save Gerald's father. Max Conrad would go on to be a record-setting pilot in the 1950s and 60s in distance flown and speed around the world. The Winona Municipal Airport in Minnesota is named Max Conrad Field in honor of him as well. Although known today as the Elizabeth Lee, the Joseph Throckmorton still survives today after restoration at the Lighthouse Yacht Club in Indiana. She is now on the registered Indiana landmark list, and there are hopes for her to be a traveling museum ship. Harsh weather was nothing that Harry Peter Grant ever shied away from, whether out in the wilderness or on the football field. Most people know the former Vikings head coach who wouldn't even allow heaters on their own sidelines or wore short sleeves in a negative 6-degree weather playoff game at the ripe age of 88 as none other than Bud Grant. The Superior, Wisconsin native loved being active and enjoying the outdoors. An older friend named Phil Cross had invited Grant and his friend Bill Blank to go hunting on Yellow Lake, approximately 60 miles south of their hometown of Superior. Cross had rented a cabin and rowboat for the trio. Grant mentioned the preparation that went into their trip.
It was a different era, and our equipment was poor. We had a couple of gunny sacks with 6 unmatched decoys apiece in them, and we wore buckle overshoes on our feet, and whatever sweaters and jackets we had. That was our hunting gear.
The morning of November 11th welcomed patchy skies, mild warm weather, and the sounds of flapping wings in the air. Grant recalls,
We set up our decoys and shot some ducks. Then, after a while, Phil said he wanted to return to the cabin to take a nap. So Bill and I rowed him back, and then we rowed across the lake again to our decoys and continued hunting.
As the 50-degree weather quickly began to plummet, the wind brought what every duck hunter yearns for.
Bill and I were shooting a few ducks, when suddenly the wind picked up from the northwest, and we were covered up in ducks. The wind blew harder and harder. As it did, we shot more and more ducks. Some of them we couldn't retrieve because the waves were so big. Finally, we figured we'd better get out of there.
As the pair began their flight to safety, Grant struggled to row the boat as the wind pushed them in every direction. Fearing that the boat would be swamped, they finally made it to shore and decided they would have to walk back around the lake to their friend Phil. The water was at least shin deep and spilling over their buckled boots.
We got about halfway, but it was swampy, and Bill fell into water up to his waist. That and the wind and snow became too much, and finally he said he couldn't go anymore. There was a train track nearby, and I tucked him next to it. and left him.
Grant was able to maneuver his way through the storm back to the cabin, soaking wet and half frozen. Grant stripped down naked and put on Cross's pair of dry waders to try and thaw himself in front of the fire. Cross was able to find Bill where Grant had left him by the railroad tracks. When the two were able to find their way back to the cabin, the trio decided that their best chance at survival was to try and make their way back to Superior to avoid being stranded in the cabin with no firewood or food. The car was moving at a snail's pace as they struggled to find the blacktop to drive on when they suddenly came upon two cars blocking the road.
We had no way to turn around, and we didn't know where we were. There were two people in each of the cars. To save gas and to keep warm, we all crowded into one car, some of us sitting on the laps of others. We'd run the car intermittently to warm up, which we did for the rest of that day and that night.
When everyone woke up, it was noticeable that the snow drifts were becoming deeper and the chance of being rescued was dwindling. Since Grant still had on his friend Phil's waders, he collected his canvas coat, hat, and gloves to begin his trek for help, stating,
"We were going to die there otherwise."
After about an hour of walking, Grant was looking for shelter amongst the trees to escape the elements. He had to push forward, and finally, with his face covered in ice and snow, he came across a two-pump gas station.
There was heat and food, and I was safe. But there was no communication. My parents, I'm sure, feared I had died. I stayed with the woman and her daughter for 2.5 days. Meanwhile, Bill and Phil and the others had frozen to death. I was sure of that.
Little did Grant know the rest of the group that he had left were rescued by a deer hunter whom they had stayed with for 2 days and consumed their entire deer. Grant's father, who was a fireman, commandeered a fire truck and followed the first snowplow down Highway 35 to look for his son. Eventually, Grant's father found him at the little gas station, and this was the first moment he had ever seen his dad cry.
I had never seen my dad cry, but he cried and cried. He tried to pay the woman for feeding me and keeping me safe, but she wouldn't take the money. Later, when we got home, my dad sent her 2 $20 bills. My dad only made $100 a month, so that was a lot of money to him, but he wanted to pay her. The woman wrote back that with the $40, her family bought a turkey for Thanksgiving, having it instead of venison, which they probably ate all year long.
After high school, Grant and his friend Bill combined their money to buy hunting land in northeast Wisconsin. Grant paid off his loans by scalping tickets to Gopher games while attending the University of Minnesota. Grant continued to pursue his love of the outdoors, including duck hunting, even well after his retirement. Another tale of survival comes from La Crosse, Wisconsin. 2 Logan High School students, Dick Bice and Laverne Reiber, as well as Reiber's dog, took to the water that afternoon on Lake Onalaska. That morning, they had attended the Armistice Day program at Logan High School. Bice recalls,
"It didn't start out like a duck hunting day."
With temperatures in the mid-40s and expecting to reach the 60s, the precarious weather gave a deception of safety as the boys left in inadequate clothing for the unsuspecting blizzard. Reiber tells,
"I wore a wool shirt, a hunting vest, and a rain jacket. That's all I had."
At approximately 1 p.m., the 2 boys and their dog loaded into their homemade skiff and began to paddle onto the water. During this time, a light drizzle began and the temperatures slowly dropped, an ominous sign that was ignored by the eager young hunters. As the weather worsened, the amount of shotgun pellets rivaled snow in the air. Ducks were fighting to find safety from the storm, creating a hunter's heaven. Reiber shot and killed a drake mallard and paddled the skiff out to retrieve the bird. During the retrieval, he was unable to return to Bice on shore due to the increasing wind and waves. Instead, he took refuge on a small, windswept island. Reiber shot all the ammunition in his shotgun, trying to call for Bice, to no avail. The 2 were permanently separated for the night. Temperatures began to drop into the 20s, and Reiber was met with a sign of grace when a group of other hunters gave him a canvas tarp to get out of the elements. Reiber wrapped the tarp around a bush, as well as used the overturned skiff to gain any sense of warmth that he could. Reiber explains his actions that night.
All I did was try to keep warm. That was all.
In a later interview, Reiber was asked if he thought he was going to die. Reiber responded with,
Never even thought about it.
Bice, a quarter-mile away, ran in circles around a shrub to stay warm. During breaks, he huddled for warmth with Reiber's dog. During this time, the boys' fathers were determined to rescue their sons from an icy fate. Raymond Bice and Joe Reiber traveled in the storm to the boat launch that their sons used earlier that day. Through sheer determination, the men tried to launch their boat in a rescue attempt and were quickly blown back onto shore by 50-mile-an-hour winds and 4-foot waves. The two men sat in their running car the rest of the night waiting for their sons, watching the 4-foot waves freeze while moving like a congealed jello. The two men could see a fire in the distance and figures walking about, sure that was their sons. That morning, with continued snow, wind, and 6-degree temperatures, the figures they watched all night fought through the waves to shore, unveiling that the two figures were men they didn't know. Desperate, the two fathers attempted another rescue that ultimately failed in an ice-covered waterway that tore the wooded bottom off their boat. Laverne Reiber was rescued that morning by a Logan High School shop teacher and outdoorsman, Burton Smith. Unwilling to give up his son's chance at life, Raymond Bice shot the lock off a nearby metal-bottomed skiff and began traveling upriver. As the ice continued to freeze, allowing Raymond Bice to carefully walk upriver, he was able to successfully rescue his son. Dick Bice and Laverne Reiber both survived the great Armistice Day Blizzard physically unharmed and went on to live fulfilling lives. Bice, an industrial arts teacher, and Reiber, chief electrician for the Lacrosse Footwear Company. As the flurry settled from the great Armistice Day Blizzard, more than 85 duck hunters throughout the Midwest lay lifeless, frozen in time. Although reports vary, 85 duck hunters perished from Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin alone. The lucky ones that were able to escape this frozen hell would forever carry the scars of that fateful day. Many hunters lost fingers, entire hands, and feet from frostbite, while others would carry the emotional scars of never being able to forget a cold and feeling of helplessness that would chill them to the bone on summer's warmest day. Dale Engler of Alma, Wisconsin, comments,
I am very thankful that all I got out of that ordeal was frostbitten feet and hands, frozen ears. I'm not counting all the nightmares I had the first few years after that day. In every single one, I'm still in that icy water, getting weaker and weaker, swimming toward a dark, snow-covered shore that is never there.
Overall, there were 159 to 210 reported lives lost due to the Armistice Day Blizzard. The gales of November proved her infamous reputation when 66 sailors descended into a watery grave on the Great Lakes due to the sinking of 3 freighters and other smaller craft. There would be many empty seats at the Thanksgiving table in 1940, and the turkeys were no exception. During the inclement weather, 1.5 million domestic turkeys perished, and the farmers were forced to sell the birds for 25 cents, advertised as fresh frozen. Turkeys were not the only animals that were victims of the storm, as thousands of livestock and wild animals succumbed to the elements. Many farmers, in trying to save their animals, were met with the same fate. The blinding blizzard caused disorientation and many farmers to be found frozen just mere yards away from their front doors. The entire Midwest was frozen in time and losing livestock, cars being buried in snowdrifts, and trains stranded. Midwestern hospitality flourished as neighbors opened their doors to anyone in need. The cost of human life takes precedence over the more than $1.5 million in damage that communities were faced to pay. A price tag everyone would have been willing to pay to have fathers, brothers, and sons return to the warmth of cozy homes the feeling of embrace from loved ones, the smell of a fresh apple pie, and the sound of Bing Crosby's Only Forever, drowning out the unforgiving cold and howling wind left behind.
The rapid change in weather that brought about devastation to the Midwest during the Armistice Day Blizzard of 1940 would generate reform in weather forecasting. The Weather Service decided to designate more funding towards technology and communication to prevent the events of November 11th from ever happening again. Weather bureaus that previously worked 12 to 15 hours a day and gave twice daily reports now worked around the clock 24/7. The number of bureaus has continually increased over time as well to allow more accurate local forecasts instead of relying on the Chicago site. Although still imperfect, today, thanks to increasing technology and efforts by the U.S. Weather Bureau, we now hold the weather at our fingertips to properly prepare for the next time Mother Nature chooses to unveil her unforgiving wrath. Next time you feel the first cold breeze of the fall, take a walk to enjoy the last warm weather, and maybe you will even see plump ducks bobbing in the waves or beautifully colored wings flapping quickly through the air. As you witness this marvelous spectacle, take a moment to remember that frigid, snowy day in November that offers a bitter, haunting reminder of the day the duck hunters died.